The night of June 14, 2011, began like so many others in Redfield, Ohio. A Tuesday night in a town where routine was more dependable than the weather, where faces stayed familiar and stories didn't change much from year to year. The air that night was warm and heavy, a Midwest summer evening pressing its weight on the cracked sidewalks and two-story houses. Windows were open, dogs barked in distant yards, and the faint hum of cicadas blended with the sound of teenagers dragging out the last hours of daylight before bed. Michael Carrington finished his shift at Redfield Auto and Repair just after 9 p.m. His boss remembered him wiping grease from his hands, grinning about how good it felt to have finally paid off his old Chevy truck. He'd been making those payments since his early 20s, and now at 28, the truck was his outright. One of his co-workers, Kenny, later told police Michael was in an especially good mood that night. He was laughing, like he had the whole night ahead of him. No stress, no hurry. Just regular Mike. By all accounts, Michael left the shop and got into that same Chevy, a battered but well-loved pickup he'd had for years. From there his trail went dark. He didn't come home. He didn't answer calls. By morning he wasn't at work. The first to notice was his mother, Ruth, who expected him for their weekly dinner the next day. Michael was the kind of son who never missed. That Wednesday evening, when his chair sat empty and his plate went cold, Ruth knew something was wrong. She called Stephen, Michael's younger brother, and by the next morning they were both on the phone with police. Detectives started where they always do, the apartment. Michael's one-bedroom was exactly as he'd left it. Rent paid. Keys on the counter. Laundry folded. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle. His bed was made with neat corners as if he'd planned to return. His Chevy, though, was gone. At first, police suspected maybe he'd just taken off for a night. But Michael wasn't a drifter. He was reliable, predictable in the way Redfield liked its men. He went to work. He saw his mother. He watched the Browns play on Sundays even when they lost. When his friends called his phone and got voicemail, they figured maybe he was busy. But when days turned into weeks, voicemail turned to silence. The first search parties combed the outskirts of town. Volunteers walked the woods, checked ditches along the highways. Flyers went up in gas stations and grocery stores. Michael Carrington, 28, dark hair, brown eyes, scar above right eyebrow. Reward for information. Detectives worked the usual angles. Could it be foul play? Michael's work at the shop sometimes led to disputes, unhappy customers, unpaid bills. They tracked down a man who'd once threatened to sue over a botched brake job, but he hadn't seen Michael in months. They interviewed an ex-girlfriend who admitted they hadn't spoken since a messy breakup 2 years prior. Every lead frayed into nothing. In those early weeks, rumors bloomed like weeds. Some whispered Michael had gotten into drugs. Others claimed he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd, maybe owed money. One man told police Michael had been spotted at a gas station off Route 17 with shady characters. Another swore he'd seen Michael in Kentucky, though no evidence backed it up. The sheriff's department chased each story until the trail went cold. By fall of 2011, Redfield was tired of hearing about it. To outsiders, Michael became another missing man on another fading poster. But to Ruth, every morning was a wound. She set his place at the table every Sunday, a quiet ritual of hope. She left his room untouched, laundry folded, bed waiting. Stephen drowned in anger. At the local bar, he'd slam his beer down, voice raw as he swore someone in town knew more than they were saying. Detectives kept at it, though less and less. They logged sightings in Kentucky, Indiana, even one in West Virginia. A psychic from Cincinnati wrote to Ruth claiming she could see Michael near water, surrounded by trees, but searches around the Redfield Reservoir turned up nothing. Each lead felt like a cruel joke, pulling the family's hope out only to strangle it. By 2013, Michael's file sat in the cold cases drawer. The Chevy truck had never been found. His bank accounts were frozen, untouched since the day he vanished. His phone was a dead line. And yet, the silence didn't mean peace. It festered. For Ruth, every night was restless. She would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the back door, listening for footsteps that never came. Stephen grew more volatile, his grief curdling into blame. He'd glare at neighbors, snap at police for giving up. He even accused Michael's ex of hiding something, though no evidence supported it. The community's sympathy soured into suspicion. People who once wept with Ruth now whispered. Maybe Michael had chosen to disappear. Maybe he'd run from something darker than they realized. In a small town like Redfield, where gossip was currency, the Carringtons became pariahs of a mystery that wouldn't let go. Still, Ruth kept Michael alive. His room stayed ready. His face stayed on the refrigerator. His birthday was still marked on the calendar. 7 candles lined the mantel, one for each year he'd been missing. By 2018 most had moved on. Michael was a memory, a ghost of Redfield's past. His file gathered dust and the town carried on. Until one summer evening, a stranger's photograph shattered the silence. For most people in Redfield, Michael Carrington became a sad story, a face on a poster whose eyes seemed to fade each year as the paper yellowed and the ink bled. But for his family, the silence was unrelenting. It wasn't just the absence of Michael that haunted them, it was the absence of answers. To lose someone without a trace was to live in a perpetual state of waiting, always dangling between hope and despair. Ruth Carrington, Michael's mother, aged 10 years in the first 2. She stopped baking on Sundays except when she made Michael's favorite peach pie, which sat untouched on the counter until she scraped it into the trash. She kept his bedroom door closed most of the time, though sometimes she'd sit on his bed just to breathe the faint, lingering scent of motor oil and cologne in the sheets. When neighbors visited, they found her more distracted, her eyes always sliding to the front door as though he might appear at any moment. Stephen, his younger brother, bore his grief differently. He was 25 when Michael vanished, and in many ways he felt his life had stopped too. He began drinking heavily, a habit that started with a nightly beer and grew into something darker. At the bar he would pick fights with strangers, lash out when people whispered about his brother. Once, in 2014, he drove out to the woods after someone claimed to have seen headlights near the reservoir the night Michael disappeared. He searched in the dark for hours, stumbling through branches, calling Michael's name until his voice gave out. When he returned home empty-handed, he punched a hole in the drywall of his mother's kitchen and broke down in tears. The police kept the file open but activity dwindled. Detectives interviewed gamblers, loan sharks, former co-workers. They looked into the possibility that Michael had run away because of debts, but nothing concrete surfaced. His bank accounts showed no activity, his social security number was dormant, and no one matching his description had been picked up in any national databases. Each year, the sheriff's office marked the anniversary of his disappearance with a brief statement. The investigation into Michael Carrington remains ongoing. But in truth, little was being done. Ruth clung to hope in strange ways. She once paid a psychic $200 to conduct a séance, hoping Michael's spirit might send a sign. Another time, she drove 2 hours to meet a woman who claimed she had dreams of missing people. The woman described a man near water walking away from his home. It was vague, but Ruth clutched to it as if it were prophecy. Stephen had no patience for that. He insisted Michael had been murdered. No one just disappears, he told reporters on the 5th anniversary of his brother's disappearance. Someone in this town knows what happened. They're keeping it quiet, but I'll find out. His anger burned so hot that friends began to avoid him, uncomfortable with the intensity of his grief. But the truth, as it would later turn out, was stranger than any of them could imagine. Because while the Carringtons mourned and Redfield whispered, Michael was alive. Not in a shallow grave, not wandering aimlessly through the woods, but building a second life in the deserts of New Mexico. When he left Redfield that night in June 2011, Michael had no clear plan. He only knew he had to get away. His debts were suffocating him, poker nights that spiraled into thousands owed, men who wanted repayment fast. And then there was the affair. The woman he'd been secretly seeing wasn't just unavailable, she was married to one of Redfield's most respected men, a church deacon with influence. Michael had felt the noose tightening both financially and socially. His family thought of him as dependable, responsible. The truth was he was drowning in lies. He drove west for hours that night, the highway stretching into an endless black ribbon. At a rest stop outside St. Louis, he sat in the cab of his Chevy, staring at his reflection in the windshield. He could turn back, confess everything, beg for help. Or he could vanish. By dawn he had made his choice. Michael abandoned his truck in a lot near Amarillo, Texas. He stripped it of plates, left the keys in the ignition. He smashed his old cell phone on the pavement and tossed the pieces into a dumpster. By the time he reached Santa Fe, he was no longer Michael Carrington. He was David Harper, a name he'd plucked from a passing highway sign that read Harper Road. Life as David was simple, and simplicity was what he craved. He found work quickly at a repair shop, grateful that engines didn't ask questions. He rented a small room in a boarding house, paid cash, and told people he was from Kansas. He never gave details, never invited anyone close. The less they knew, the safer he felt. And yet, over time, he began to stitch together a life. The cafe on the corner knew his order: black coffee, no sugar. The bartender at a dimly lit bar downtown knew when to pour him a whiskey and when to leave him alone. His landlord noticed he always paid on time in folded bills. To them, he wasn't a mystery, just David, the quiet mechanic with the scar above his eyebrow. But even in the desert, Michael couldn't escape himself. At night, lying in the creaky bed of his rented room, he thought of his mother's Sunday dinners, of Stephen's laugh, of the way Redfield smelled in autumn. He missed them, but shame was heavier than homesickness. To call would mean admitting the lies, the debts, the affair. To show up would mean facing the years of grief he'd caused. So he stayed silent. The irony was, in Santa Fe he wasn't hiding from the law. Disappearing wasn't a crime. But he was hiding from something worse, the disappointment in his family's eyes if they ever saw what he'd become. For 7 years he managed to stay invisible. He avoided cameras, kept off social media, never let anyone take his picture. He had grown used to being a ghost in plain sight. Until one summer evening in 2018, when a tourist's photograph of a street guitarist captured him in the background. A simple mistake, sipping coffee on a bench, unaware of the lens pointed his way. That photograph would unravel everything. It was a photograph that undid 7 years of silence. The woman who took it, Hannah Perez, hadn't intended anything extraordinary. She was a tourist in Santa Fe, camera slung over her shoulder, charmed by the color and chaos of the plaza. A guitarist played under a cottonwood tree, his hat on the ground for coins. Hannah snapped a few pictures, adjusted the angle, and later posted them to her social media. They were the kind of images that usually drift unnoticed through the endless scroll of the internet. But in the blurred background of one, behind the guitarist's bent frame, sat a man on a bench. Dark hair. Scar above the eyebrow. A coffee cup in hand. Back in Ohio, thousands of miles away, Michael's childhood friend Jason was scrolling when he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than the prick of recognition. That scar. That jawline. His breath caught, the coffee in his own hand spilling onto the floor. He clicked on the photo, enlarged it, stared until his eyes ached. Could it be? 7 years had passed, but he knew that face. He was sure of it. Jason sent the image to Ruth Carrington, Michael's mother. She opened it on her old desktop computer, her hands trembling so hard she almost dropped the mouse. For 7 years she had prayed for a sign, dreamed of Michael's face, searched crowds for him. Now here he was, not in a vision but in pixels, alive in the background of a stranger's photo. She wept, her sobs loud enough to bring Stephen running. He saw the image, swore and punched the wall. The photograph was delivered to the sheriff's office the next day. Detectives stared at it, skeptical at first. But side by side with Michael's old driver's license, the resemblance was chilling. The scar matched. The curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, older, leaner, but him. 2 detectives flew to New Mexico within a week. They canvassed the plaza, showing locals the missing poster of Michael Carrington. At the cafe on the corner, the owner squinted at the photo and nodded. "That's David," she said. "David Harper. Comes in every morning for coffee. Black, no sugar." It didn't take long to find him. 2 days later, they spotted him at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. He wore a faded work shirt, his hands dark with grease, his hair longer than in his old photos. For a moment they thought he might deny it, might insist he was David Harper, not the ghost of Michael Carrington. But when their eyes met, the fight drained out of him. His shoulders slumped, his face collapsed into something tired, almost relieved. In the interview room, Michael's story spilled out in halting waves. He hadn't been kidnapped. He hadn't been murdered. He had walked away. The detectives listened as he described that night in 2011. The debts, the threats, the shame of a secret affair with a married woman. He felt cornered in Redfield, crushed by expectations, terrified of what would happen when the truth came out. So he drove west, abandoned his Chevy truck, smashed his phone and gave himself a new name. David Harper. He said it like a confession, like a curse. For 7 years he built a life of shadows. Work, rent, coffee, whiskey, sleep. A cycle that numbed him enough to keep going. He said he thought of his mother every day, but shame silenced him. To call would be to admit what he'd done, the lies he'd told, the grief he'd caused. So he stayed silent, convinced it was better for them to believe he was gone than to know he had chosen to leave. The detectives asked if he understood what his family had endured. Michael buried his face in his hands. "Every day," he whispered. "Every day I thought about it." News spread quickly. Missing Redfield man found alive in New Mexico. The headline was surreal. For 7 years, his family had lived in limbo, mourning him as dead, clinging to hope. Now he was alive, drinking coffee in the desert under another man's name. The reunion was nothing like the movies. Ruth clung to him, sobbing into his shirt as though she could make up for the lost years in one embrace. Stephen stood in the corner, jaw tight, unable to look at his brother. When Michael tried to reach for him, Stephen pulled back. 7 years, he spat. 7 years you let us think you were dead. Do you know what that did to Mom? To me? His voice cracked. You don't deserve her tears. The community's reaction was divided. Some were relieved, amazed that a man thought dead had been found alive. Others felt betrayed. For years they had searched, prayed, and speculated. They had held vigils and whispered theories. Now they learned Michael hadn't been taken. He had left. To them it wasn't a miracle. It was abandonment. And the law? The law had little to say. Disappearing wasn't a crime. He hadn't stolen, hadn't committed fraud. He was free to go where he pleased. The only sentences he faced were the ones handed down by his family and community. Michael tried to explain. He sat with Ruth late at night, tears on his cheeks, telling her about the debts, the affair, the shame. She held his hand and said she forgave him, but forgiveness didn't erase the years. For Stephen there was no forgiveness at all. He told friends he felt like he'd buried his brother once, and now he had to bury him again, only this time Michael was standing in front of him. The aftermath was messy, filled with questions that had no clean answers. Was Michael a victim of his own desperation, or a coward who abandoned those who loved him? Was his silence selfish, or was it survival? Could a family truly heal after 7 years of grief built on a lie of absence? What is certain is that the truth came out not through detective work or breakthroughs in forensic science, but through chance. A tourist's photo shared online captured a ghost in the background and pulled him back into the world. And that is what makes this story linger, haunting long after the headlines fade. That a man believed dead was alive, hiding not in the shadows but in plain sight. That a single photograph could unravel years of grief. And that sometimes, the most painful truth is not that someone is gone, but that they chose to walk away.